They thought I'd finally snapped, lost my mind, gone completely insane. When you're a 61-year-old widower who starts digging a hole in your backyard at 5 in the morning, making noise that wakes the entire neighborhood, your sanity gets questioned pretty quickly. But I wasn't crazy. I was desperate, broke, and sitting on top of something that most people didn't even know existed. My name is Frank Kowalski, and in the spring of 2020, I discovered that my small property in Lakeview, Oregon, was sitting directly above a geothermal hotspot that would change everything about how I survived in retirement. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to February 2020, when my life was falling apart and I was running out of options. I'd retired from the railroad in 2019 after 40 years of service, looking forward to a comfortable retirement with my wife Helen in the small cabin we'd bought in South Central Oregon. We'd chosen Lakeview specifically because it was affordable, quiet, and had the kind of high desert climate we'd always loved. Cold winters, hot summers, and endless blue skies. The plan was simple: live modestly on my pension and Social Security, enjoy our golden years, maybe do some traveling. Then Helen died. Sudden heart attack in November 2019, 3 months after we'd moved into the cabin. No warning, no chance to say goodbye, just gone. And with her went half of our retirement income, because her pension died with her. I was suddenly living alone on about $1,800 per month, trying to maintain a household that we'd budgeted for 2 incomes. The math didn't work. My mortgage was $650 per month. Property taxes, insurance, and utilities added another $400. That left me with $750 for food, medication, vehicle expenses, and everything else. I was barely scraping by, and winter heating costs were killing me. My cabin was old, poorly insulated, and heated with propane. During the coldest months, December through February, my heating bills were running $350, $400 per month. That was half of my discretionary income, gone just to stay warm. I was cutting back on everything else, eating cheap food, skipping medications, letting the cabin get colder than was comfortable, and I was still falling behind on bills. By February 2020, I was facing a choice: sell the cabin and move to some cheap apartment, or find a way to dramatically reduce my expenses. Selling meant giving up the home Helen and I had chosen together, the last place we'd been happy. I wasn't ready to do that. So I started looking for alternatives, for ways to cut costs, for solutions that didn't require money I didn't have. That's when I remembered something from my railroad days. Back in the 1990s, I'd worked on a line that ran through northern Nevada, near some geothermal power plants. I'd learned about geothermal energy, about how heat from the Earth's interior could be tapped and used for power generation. I'd seen the steam vents, the hot springs, the evidence that enormous amounts of heat existed just below the surface in certain geological areas. And I remembered that Lakeview, Oregon, was in a geothermal zone. The town had hot springs, had a history of geothermal activity, was sitting on top of the same geological features that created geothermal resources throughout the Basin and Range province. I'd never thought much about it before, but now, desperate for a heating solution, I started researching. What I found was fascinating and gave me hope for the first time in months. Lakeview was indeed in a significant geothermal area. The town's hot springs were just the surface expression of much deeper heat. Geothermal gradients in the area were abnormally high, meaning that ground temperatures increased much faster with depth than in normal areas. In a typical location, ground temperature increases about 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit for every 100 feet of depth. In Lakeview's geothermal zone, the increase was 5 to 10 degrees per 100 feet, sometimes even higher in hot spots. That meant that if I could drill or dig deep enough, I might be able to access significantly warm water or steam that could be used for heating. Commercial geothermal wells in the area were drilled to depths of 1,000 to 3,000 feet, accessing water at temperatures of 200 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. But I didn't need anything that deep or that hot. I just needed water warm enough to heat my cabin, maybe 120, 140 degrees, which might be accessible at much shallower depths if I was lucky enough to be sitting on a hot spot. The problem was that drilling a well, even a shallow one, would cost $10,000 to $20,000, money I absolutely didn't have. Professional geothermal system installation would cost even more. I was looking at solutions that were completely out of reach financially. But then I had an idea, a crazy, probably stupid idea, but the only idea I had. What if I didn't drill? What if I just dug? I had a small backhoe that I'd bought years ago for property maintenance. I had time, energy, and nothing to lose. What if I excavated by hand and machine, going as deep as I could, and saw what I found? If I hit warm water or steam at any accessible depth, I could figure out how to use it. If I didn't, I'd just have a big hole and would be no worse off than I already was. My neighbors thought I was having a breakdown. When I started excavating in early March 2020, digging a pit in my backyard about 20 feet from my cabin, they gathered to watch and offer opinions. None of them were supportive. "Frank, what are you doing?" asked Bill Morrison, who lived in the cabin next to mine. "You're digging a giant hole in your yard. Why? Are you looking for something? Burying something? What's going on?" "I'm looking for geothermal heat," I said. "Lakeview is in a geothermal zone. I think there might be hot water or steam below my property, and I'm going to dig until I find it." Bill stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "You're digging for hot water?" "Frank, that's not how it works. You need to drill wells, deep wells, thousands of feet. You can't just dig a hole with a backhoe and expect to find geothermal energy. That's crazy." His wife Susan was more direct. "Frank, we're worried about you. You've been through a lot with Helen's passing. Maybe you should talk to someone, get some help. This digging project, it's not rational. You're going to hurt yourself or waste what little money you have left." Other neighbors echoed similar concerns. They thought I was having a grief-induced breakdown, that I was engaging in pointless activity to avoid dealing with Helen's death, that I needed psychological help rather than encouragement. The town building inspector came by, summoned by a neighbor complaint, to make sure I wasn't violating any codes. He examined my excavation, which was about 8 feet deep at that point, and determined that I wasn't doing anything illegal. I was digging on my own property, wasn't near any utility lines or structures, and wasn't creating a hazard. He signed off on it, but he also looked at me with concern, clearly thinking I was wasting my time. I kept digging. By late March, I was down 15 feet, and I'd hit water. Not hot water, just regular groundwater, cold and clear. I installed a sump pump to keep the excavation from flooding, and I kept going deeper. 20 feet, 25 feet, 30 feet. The excavation was now a pit about 12 feet in diameter and 30 feet deep, with shored walls to prevent collapse. I was exhausted, spending 6 hours a day digging, hauling out soil, managing the water that kept seeping in. My neighbors had stopped offering opinions and just watched with a mixture of pity and fascination, waiting for me to give up or hit bedrock or finally accept that this wasn't going to work. Then, at 32 feet deep, something changed. I was at the bottom of the pit, digging with a shovel because the backhoe couldn't reach that deep, when I noticed the water seeping into the excavation was warmer than it had been. Not hot, but noticeably warmer, maybe 70-80 degrees instead of the 50-degree groundwater I'd been pumping out. My heart started racing. This was it. This was evidence that I was getting closer to geothermal heat. I kept digging, going down another 2 feet, and the water got warmer. At 35 feet, it was probably 90-100 degrees, warm enough that I could feel heat radiating from it. At 38 feet, I hit something that made me stop and stare in disbelief. Steam. Actual steam, rising from cracks in the rock at the bottom of the pit. The water seeping in was now hot enough to create visible steam in the cool March air, probably 140, 160 degrees. I'd found it. I'd actually found accessible geothermal heat, just 38 feet below my property. I climbed out of the pit, my hands shaking with excitement and exhaustion, and I just sat there for a long time, watching steam rise from the hole I'd dug. This was real. This was going to work. I could use this heat to warm my cabin, could eliminate my propane bills, could solve the financial crisis that had been crushing me. My neighbors saw the steam and came over to investigate. Bill Morrison stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at the steam rising from the bottom, and his expression changed from skepticism to amazement. "Frank, is that steam? Is that actually geothermal heat? You found it? You actually found it?" "I found it," I said. 38 feet down, hot water probably 150 degrees or more. Enough to heat my cabin all winter. Bill was quiet for a moment, then he said something I hadn't expected. I owe you an apology. I thought you were crazy. I thought you were wasting your time, that this was some kind of breakdown, but you were right. You knew what you were looking for, and you found it. This is incredible. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. The crazy old man who'd been digging a hole for weeks had actually found geothermal heat, had tapped into something that could provide free heating for his cabin. People who'd been mocking me were now curious, asking questions, wanting to understand how I was going to use this resource. But I didn't have all the answers yet. I'd found the heat, but I still needed to figure out how to capture it, how to transfer it to my cabin, how to build a system that would actually work. And I needed to do it cheaply, with minimal equipment, using whatever materials and knowledge I had. That became my project for the next 2 months. Finding geothermal heat was one thing. Actually using it to heat my cabin was another challenge entirely. I had hot water and steam at the bottom of a 38-foot pit, but I needed to get that heat into my cabin, 20 feet away, and I needed to do it safely and efficiently with almost no money. I spent a week just observing the pit, measuring temperatures, understanding the flow of hot water. What I discovered was that I had a steady seep of water at approximately 155 degrees Fahrenheit, flowing at a rate of maybe 2 to 3 gallons per minute. That doesn't sound like much, but it represented a significant amount of thermal energy. Water at 155 degrees contains about 123 BTUs per pound, more than water at 55 degrees, typical cold groundwater temperature. At 2 gallons per minute, that's about 16 pounds per minute, or roughly 2,000 BTUs per minute, or 120,000 BTUs per hour of available heat. For context, my cabin required approximately 15,000 to 20,000 BTUs per hour to maintain comfortable temperatures during cold weather. I had 6 times more heat available than I needed, if I could figure out how to capture and use it. The solution I came up with was simple in concept, but required careful execution. I would build a heat exchanger at the bottom of the pit, capturing the hot water and using it to heat a closed loop of water that would circulate to my cabin. The closed loop would prevent any contamination issues and would allow me to control the system more easily. I started by installing a collection basin at the bottom of the pit, a 55-gallon steel drum with the top cut off, positioned to catch the hot water as it seeped from the rock. I installed a coil of copper tubing inside the drum, about 50 feet of half-inch tubing coiled tightly, creating a heat exchanger where cold water from my cabin would be heated by contact with the hot geothermal water. The system worked on a simple principle. Cold water from my cabin would flow down through an insulated pipe to the heat exchanger at the bottom of the pit, would be heated by the geothermal water, and would flow back up to the cabin where it would release its heat through radiators or baseboard heaters. A small circulation pump would keep the water moving, and the system would run continuously, providing steady heat. The materials cost me about $800, which I scraped together by selling some tools and equipment I didn't need. I bought copper tubing, PEX pipe for the supply and return lines, a small circulation pump, insulation, fittings, and a few baseboard radiators salvaged from a demolition site. Everything was used or cheap, cobbled together from whatever I could afford, but it was enough to build a functioning system. The installation took 3 weeks of hard work. I had to run insulated pipes from the pit to my cabin, bury them below the frost line to prevent freezing, and install the radiators inside the cabin. I had to wire the circulation pump, test for leaks, and make sure the system was safe and wouldn't create any hazards. My neighbors watched the construction with renewed interest. They'd seen the steam, knew I'd found real geothermal heat, and now they wanted to see if I could actually make it work. Bill Morrison helped me with some of the heavier work, and other neighbors offered advice and encouragement. The skepticism had turned to curiosity and support. In early May 2020, I fired up the system for the first time. I turned on the circulation pump, and water started flowing through the loop. Cold water went down to the pit, passed through the heat exchanger, where it was warmed by the 155-degree geothermal water, and came back up to the cabin at approximately 135 to 140 degrees. That hot water flowed through the baseboard radiators, releasing heat into the cabin, and then circulated back down to be reheated. The system worked. Within an hour, my cabin was noticeably warmer. Within 2 hours, it was comfortable, 68 degrees inside, even though outside temperatures were in the 50s. The radiators were warm to the touch, radiating gentle heat throughout the space. And the system was running on nothing but a small circulation pump that consumed about 60 watts of electricity, costing maybe $5 per month to operate. I'd done it. I'd built a geothermal heating system for $800 that was providing free heat to my cabin. No propane, no wood, no fossil fuels, just heat from the earth, captured and used through simple physics and basic plumbing. But the real test would come in winter, when temperatures dropped and heating demands increased. I spent the summer and fall monitoring the system, making small adjustments, improving insulation, optimizing flow rates. The geothermal source never varied. It consistently provided 155-degree water at 2 to 3 gallons per minute, a steady, reliable heat source that required no maintenance and cost nothing to operate. My neighbors were amazed and increasingly interested. Bill Morrison asked if I thought there was geothermal heat under his property too. Others wanted to know if they could dig similar pits, if this was something that could work for multiple properties in the area. I explained that Lakeview was in a geothermal zone, but that didn't mean every property had accessible heat at shallow depths. I'd gotten lucky, had happened to be sitting on a hot spot where geothermal water was close to the surface. Other properties might need to dig deeper or might not have accessible heat at all. But the interest was real, and people started talking about the possibility of neighborhood geothermal heating, of multiple properties tapping into the heat that existed below the ground. The first real cold snap came in November 2020, temperatures dropping into the 20s at night. This was the test I'd been waiting for, the proof that my system could handle real heating demands. I monitored temperatures obsessively, checking the cabin, the radiators, the water temperatures in the supply and return lines. The system performed flawlessly. Even when outside temperatures dropped to 20 degrees, the geothermal heat exchanger was delivering 135-degree water to my cabin, and the radiators were maintaining comfortable interior temperatures of 65-68 degrees. The circulation pump ran continuously, but at 60 watts, it was consuming less electricity than a light bulb. My heating costs for November were $5 for the pump electricity. That's it. $5 to heat my cabin for an entire month compared to the $350–400 I'd been spending on propane the previous year. December and January brought even colder weather, with temperatures regularly dropping into the teens and occasionally into single digits. My system continued to perform perfectly. The geothermal source never faltered, never decreased in temperature or flow rate. It provided steady, reliable heat, regardless of outside conditions. My heating costs for the entire winter were approximately $30 for electricity to run the circulation pump. I'd gone from spending $1,200 per winter on propane to spending $30 on electricity. I'd reduced my heating costs by 97.5%, and I'd done it with an $800 investment that had already paid for itself in saved propane costs. But the impact went beyond just the money. The quality of the heat was remarkable. Radiant heat from hot water radiators is gentle, even, comfortable. There were no temperature swings, no cold drafts, no dry air from forced heating. The cabin maintained steady temperatures day and night, and the heat felt natural, pleasant, almost luxurious. I was more comfortable than I'd been in the propane-heated cabin, and I was spending almost nothing. My neighbors were stunned. They'd watched me dig a hole, had called me crazy, had predicted failure. Now they were seeing me heat my cabin all winter for essentially free, using a resource that existed right below the ground, accessed with a simple excavation and basic plumbing. Bill Morrison was the first to ask if I'd help him explore his property for geothermal heat. We did some test drilling in his backyard, and at 45 feet we found warm water, not as hot as mine, but still 120 degrees, enough to provide significant heating. I helped him build a similar system, and by winter 2021, he was also heating with geothermal energy, reducing his costs by 80%. Other neighbors followed. Within 2 years, 5 properties in my immediate area had tapped into geothermal heat, all at depths between 35 and 50 feet, all finding water hot enough to provide meaningful heating. We'd created an informal neighborhood geothermal district, multiple properties using the heat that existed below the ground, dramatically reducing our collective heating costs. By 2022, 2 years after I'd started digging that hole, my life had changed in ways I never expected. I was living comfortably on my modest pension, no longer stressed about heating bills, no longer choosing between warmth and food. The geothermal system had solved my immediate financial crisis, but it had also done something more. It had given me purpose, had turned me into an unexpected expert on shallow geothermal systems, and had created a small movement in Lakeview around accessible geothermal heating. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the neighborhood geothermal systems, and suddenly I was getting calls from across the region. People wanted to know if their properties might have accessible geothermal heat, wanted help exploring and developing systems, wanted to understand the principles and economics. I started consulting, helping people assess their properties, providing guidance on excavation and system design. I didn't charge much, just enough to cover my time and expenses, because I remembered what it felt like to be desperate and broke, and I wanted to help others who were in similar situations. By 2023, I'd helped develop geothermal systems on 15 properties in the Lakeview area. Not all of them were as successful as mine. Some properties required deeper excavation, some found water that was warm but not hot enough for primary heating. Some hit bedrock before finding any geothermal resource. But about 60% of the properties we explored found usable geothermal heat at depths of 30-60 feet, accessible with hand excavation or small drilling equipment, and capable of providing significant heating cost reductions. The economics were compelling for people in situations like mine, retirees or low-income residents who were struggling with heating costs. An excavation and basic system could be built for $1,000 to $2,000 if you did the work yourself, or $5,000, $8,000 if you hired help. That investment would typically reduce heating costs by 60–90%, meaning payback in 2 to 5 years, followed by decades of nearly free heating. The University of Oregon sent researchers to study the Lakeview geothermal systems, interested in understanding the geology and the potential for broader application. They confirmed what we discovered through trial and error. Lakeview was sitting on an extensive geothermal resource, with abnormally high heat flow that made shallow geothermal systems viable in ways they wouldn't be in most locations. But they also found that similar conditions existed in other parts of the Basin and Range Province, throughout Nevada, parts of Idaho, Eastern California, and other geothermal zones. The potential for shallow geothermal heating was much larger than anyone had realized. The researchers published papers, and suddenly Lakeview's neighborhood geothermal systems were being discussed in academic circles and renewable energy conferences. I was invited to speak at a geothermal conference in Reno, to share my experience and explain how a broke retiree with a backhoe had tapped into a resource that most people thought required expensive drilling and professional installation. The jealous neighbors who'd called me crazy for digging had become advocates and participants. Bill Morrison had become my closest friend and collaborator, helping other neighbors explore their properties. Susan Morrison, who'd suggested I needed psychological help, now ran a small business helping people design and install geothermal systems. The community that had mocked my hole was now proud of it, saw it as innovation rather than insanity. By 2024, 4 years after I'd started digging, approximately 30 properties in the Lakeview area had some form of shallow geothermal heating. The collective reduction in propane and electricity consumption was significant, probably saving the community $100,000 per year in heating costs. But more importantly, it had changed how people thought about energy and resources, had shown that solutions to expensive problems sometimes existed right beneath our feet, waiting for someone desperate or crazy enough to dig for them. My own system continued to perform flawlessly. 4 winters of continuous operation, 0 maintenance beyond occasionally checking the circulation pump, and absolutely reliable heat regardless of outside temperatures. The geothermal source never varied, never decreased, just provided steady 155-degree water year after year. My total heating costs over 4 winters had been approximately $120 for electricity to run the pump. I'd saved roughly $4,000 in propane costs, and the savings would continue for as long as I lived in the cabin. But the real value wasn't just financial. The geothermal system had given me security, had eliminated the anxiety of wondering how I'd afford to heat my home, had allowed me to live with dignity on a modest income. It had turned a crisis into an opportunity, had transformed desperation into innovation. The steam that rose from my pit every cold morning was a visible reminder that solutions exist, that resources are often closer than we think, that sometimes the crazy ideas are the ones worth pursuing. Frank Kowalski, the crazy old man who dug a hole in his backyard, had become Frank Kowalski, the geothermal pioneer who'd shown that accessible renewable energy didn't require expensive technology or professional installation, just determination, basic knowledge, and the willingness to dig until you found what you were looking for. My name is Frank Kowalski, and jealous neighbors called me crazy for digging a 38-foot pit in my backyard. They thought I'd lost my mind, that I was wasting time and money, that grief had broken me, but that hole saved my life, literally and financially. The steam that rises from it heats my cabin all night, every night, for essentially free. And the neighbors who mocked me, they're digging their own holes now, tapping into the same geothermal resource, benefiting from the crazy idea that turned out to be brilliant. That's the story of the hole that changed everything, and the lesson about desperation, innovation, and the value of being willing to dig deeper than anyone thinks is reasonable. Sometimes the solutions to our biggest problems are right beneath our feet. We just have to be brave enough, or desperate enough, or crazy enough to dig until we find them.